Okay, so we will continue our discussion on chapter 23, which is the action of hormones and how they help integrate mammalian metabolism. So several things that we will discuss today, you already know them. Okay, we have discussed them during this class. But we are trying to bring everything together here, right, towards the end. And this is what I actually tell you, that once we are near the end of this class, which is now today, you will know most of the metabolic pathways and the roles of different organs, hormones, in how the metabolism is integrated overall in the big picture. Okay. And so we will continue our discussion on that, and you will see, we will repeat several concepts that we have already learned, seen, and it should be, a good way to end this class. So here in this table, I'm listing you different organs that are primarily involved. These are not the only organs, but main organs that are primarily involved in the metabolism of sugar, fatty acid, and proteins. Right. So you'll see on the left-hand side, the brain. It does not have any energy reservoir. It doesn't like to export any fuel for anybody else in the body. And you can see why, because it wants to coordinate activities of different organs. And this is where the hypothalamus is, right? Coordination center. And brain's preferred substrate is glucose. And when it is not able to get glucose, ketone bodies, right? Such as during starvation or during metabolic disorders such as diabetes. So no energy sources exported, none. Skeletal muscles, when they are resting, they have the reservoir of glycogen, and their preferred substrates is listed as fatty acid. So if there is fatty acid, they will use them, and we have large mass of skeletal muscle in your body, and they also export nothing. They use it for themselves. So they store, remember, 1% of your skeletal mass is glycogen storage. So they do have storage, but they prefer the substrate fatty acid. When you have done, an extensive exercise, a strenuous exercise, your skeletal muscles have lost their glycogen because they have utilized it, and that's what they prefer, right? That's the preferred substrate from glycogen. And because skeletal muscles, when they are doing strenuous exercises, they are operating under anaerobic conditions somewhat, and in that case, they produce lactate. If you recall, we talked about that, right? Heart muscles, similarly, glycogen, preferred substrate fatty acid, they don't export anything, and so on. So this is something that you already know, but in terms of liver, the liver has the preferred substrate as fatty acids. Okay, so they have listed here all three, but their preferred fuel is fatty acid, although they can utilize amino acids and glucose if needed. And of course, you also know that liver also stores glycogen. 10% of storage is glycogen, as well as neutral fat. Okay, so with that, I want to show you some of these organs and what their specialized metabolic functions are. Brain, of course, brain, you know that it integrates input from body and surroundings, right? And sends signals to other organs. And brain also transports, brain cells also transport ions that help maintain their membrane potentials. Right? The lymphatic systems that you know carries lipids from intestine to liver. We talked about that in our fatty acid class. You know what lymphatic system is, right? It's a system that consists of these tubes and lymph nodes, you know, that run throughout our body, right? And the tubes are called lymph vessels or lymphatic vessels, and it's a very important part of our immune system, right? It helps fight bacterial infections or any other infections that our body might be facing. But anyway, it actually is the system that carries lipids, if you recall, in the form of chylomicron from intestine to the liver for metabolism. Adipose tissues, generally people think as they are lame, you know, they store fat and synthesize fat, but they also are important, and we'll discuss that at least one hormone that is secreted from adipose tissues that helps regulate our weight and energy expenditure. We will also talk about brown fat, brown adipose tissues called BATs. And BATs are these specialized tissues typically found in the infants only. Once you're adult, they're gone. And they are very important for thermogenesis. Skeletal muscles here, of course, they do mechanical work. They utilize ATP. Small intestine, absolutely fascinating structure, right? If you remember, intestinal mucosa is a very, very specialized structure. It absorbs nutrients from what you eat and moves them into the blood or through lymphatic system. Portal vein, very important. Portal vein is the connection between the liver and intestine, okay? This is how liver gets the first access to any nutrients we ingest and helps and coordinates metabolism of fuel. So it carries nutrients from intestine to the liver. That's how that's how liver gets access to glucose, proteins, fats, whatever we ingest, and figures out how much of it each one of that is. I always say liver and pancreas, those are two top, one of my favorite organs, and we want them to be functioning well always. You know, a little dead brain can still be okay, but yeah, you don't want liver and pancreas to go. Liver pretty much, you know, in metabolism, if somebody asks you a question, which organ does something, and you had to take a random guess and say liver, you might be right. That's important. That's how much important the function of liver is. It processes fat, sugars, proteins from diet, synthesizes and distributes several different types of lipids, ketone bodies it synthesizes. You know, if you remember bile acid, etc., right? Glucose, it actually does carry out gluconeogenesis. And so it can make glucose for other tissues like brain. You know, it carries out urea cycle, so it can excrete nitrogen from amino acids, etc. Right? Very, very important. And of course, pancreas, and we'll talk a little more about pancreas. I'll show you a little structure. It's at least you know that it secretes insulin and glucagon in response to changes in the blood glucose levels. But it also is a place where several of these enzymes are synthesized and stored, right? Pancreas is very fascinating organ, very, very important. So we'll briefly discuss something that you already know again. Okay, so please don't mind if it is a repetition of what we are going to see in the next 3 slides at least. Okay, and we'll talk about the metabolism of sugar, amino acids, and fat in the liver. Okay, you know, as I said, you know, liver gets access to all the ingested food via portal veins, right? Portal vein provides a direct route from small intestine to the liver, right? And so liver also has tremendous, flexibility, if you can say that, metabolic flexibility, right? And adaptability. It can use any of the fuel potentially to generate ATP, although it prefers to use fatty acid as its primary fuel. But it does have tremendous metabolic flexibility. And so if you want to know, just in passing, liver enzymes, turn over at a rate that is 5 to 10 times higher than the rate for cells from any other tissues. So liver enzymes are turned over at a much, much faster rate. Why would that be case? That would be the case because liver has this tremendous metabolic flexibility and adaptability. Because suddenly you decided to eat just meat, steak for the dinner and lunch tomorrow. So liver should be able to actually utilize that fuel and try to distribute if needed. Right, so liver enzymes are very, very dynamic. They're produced and turnover. Turnover means degraded at a much faster rate, than any other tissues, for example, muscle tissues, right? So let's look at this slide. So if you bring sugar in, right, you will first thing hexokinase will do is glucose. It will make glucose 6 phosphate. And if you recall, liver has a special hexokinase called glucokinase. Do you remember that? The glucokinase is the one of the hexokinase 4, formally speaking, that has a very high Km value, almost 10 millimolar for the glucose. And that's how it is able to operate whenever glucose is brought into the liver. Glucose is a substrate, and glucokinase, the enzyme for which the Km is 10 millimolar, it is operating under kcat by Km condition. And therefore, there is a linear dependence on the formation of product, which will be glucose 6 phosphate, and at the concentration of glucose. And that's how liver cells sense glucose levels in the food. You remember that? We talked about that. So it's a glucokinase, helps out. But anyway, once glucose is brought into the liver cells, you will form glucose 6 phosphate. Now, these arrows that you are seeing here, they have some meanings. Okay, you can see that some arrows are going upwards, some are going downwards, and some are horizontal. Okay, so the arrows that are going upward are indicating anabolic pathways, which means synthesis of a larger molecule from a smaller precursor. The ones that are going downwards are catabolic pathways, right? And the one that is going horizontal is basically they are distributed to other tissues and cells. Okay, so if liver brought in glucose 6 phosphate, of course, liver has a glucose 6 phosphatase system. It can actually remove the phosphate group and release the glucose that is produced into the blood, right? So that's number one. It can happen. If liver glycogen levels are depleted, they will be replenished by turning on the glycogen synthase. So you will see liver glycogen will be replenished. Glucose 6 phosphate will undergo glycolysis, and glycolysis will produce pyruvate, and pyruvate will then produce acetyl coenzyme A, pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, right? And pyruvate dehydrogenase complex will produce acetyl coenzyme A. Then acetyl coenzyme A can go through the citric acid cycle and produce lots and lots of reducing equivalents. If you remember, there is a finite number. When I say lots and lots, I really don't mean infinity. I mean like 3 molecules of NADH and 1 molecule of FADH2, for example, through each turn of citric acid cycle. But regardless, those reducing equivalents will go on and produce ATP by oxidative phosphorylation, right? So all that is clear to you. You know this already. Acetyl coenzyme A, once it is produced, it can also go on to make new fatty acids that might be needed for some tissues. So liver will synthesize that. That's why arrows are going up in this case. It will also be utilized to make cholesterols, etc. Right? So I just want to say that the transfer of blood glucose through GLUT2 transporter, right? If you remember, GLUT2 is the main transporter for transfer of glucose between the liver and blood, right? And it's not like GLUT4, if you remember. GLUT4 is the insulin-dependent glucose transporter, right? And GLUT4 is primarily found in the adipose tissues and the muscle tissues like skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles. Okay, so GLUT4 is insulin dependent, whereas GLUT2 is not, right? GLUT2 does not rely on insulin for facilitated diffusion of glucose. Just reiterating this so you are aware of that and you know you can connect. Now here is the amino acid metabolism in the liver, right? So you bring amino acids, and you remember very well they are brought into the liver, right? So you, if needed, you can make new liver proteins. Remember, liver enzymes are turned over at a much higher rates, 5 to 10 times higher rate than the other cells. So you'll make some new liver proteins if needed. And if you have made some new other proteins, you might actually, liver can also synthesize some plasma proteins that it can release into the bloodstream, right? Amino acids, they can be distributed in the blood, so they can go to tissues to make new proteins if needed, right? And amino acids can be utilized to make nucleotides and hormones and porphyrins, etc. And we didn't talk about the pathway that does that. Maybe in 372 you learn that. But amino acids, you can see now going down, catabolism of amino acid. You can go catabolize amino acids into two separate ways. The nitrogen portion that goes into the urea cycle, and the carbon portion of the molecule, for example, will go on to make pyruvate or any such species that can be fed into the citric acid cycle, right? So that's what they're showing you downhill again. So you can see 6, 7, and 8 is the same pathway that we just discussed. Acetyl-CoA can be also utilized to synthesize new fatty acids, new lipid molecules, right? Pyruvate, if needed, can be utilized to make new glucose molecules, right, via gluconeogenesis. So that's reaction number 5 here. And then glucose can be exported and go to muscle cells as glycogen storage. If you remember, amino acids, when they are broken down in the muscles, they are brought in, the ammonia is brought in to the liver cells in the form of alanine. So that alanine transamination reaction also will give pyruvate and ammonia, right? So that's what happens to metabolism of amino acids in the liver. Everything you know here, there's nothing new. And the reason you know that is that we have discussed each one of those reactions. What about fatty acids? Remember, under most circumstances, fatty acids are the primary oxidative fuel in the liver, okay? Under most circumstances. And you know that fatty acid synthesis primarily occurs in the adipose tissues and in the liver, right? So anyway, once fatty acids are brought into, are there in the liver, what can they do? They can make new liver lipids, right? Or they can go on to generate energy. So they can undergo beta oxidation. Once you do beta oxidations, you will generate reducing equivalents. An example is shown here as NADH. But they are all metabolized to acetyl coenzyme A, right? Acetyl coenzyme A again can go through the citric acid cycle, produce some more new energies, and generate ATP in oxidative phosphorylation reaction. So that's reaction number 3 and 4. Acetyl coenzyme A can be utilized to produce ketone bodies in the blood. Let's say you are starving, or the cells are starving metabolically, right? Brain can use ketone body as the fuel when the glucose is not available. So liver will synthesize ketone bodies and then try to export it into the blood so it can go. Again, acetyl coenzyme A can be utilized to make cholesterol. Cholesterol is used to make certain hormones like steroid hormones we talked about, and bile acid and bile salts. So that's what happens. And of course, fatty acids can also be released into the blood plasma, right? So you will have some free fatty acids in the blood that can go and bind to certain plasma proteins and go to target tissues if needed. That brings me to this very, very interesting and new concept that you didn't learn when we talked about fatty acid metabolism. Okay. And I tell my students many times, when I was, I would listen to, 1010 radio, I would hear every now and then that a newborn infant was unfortunately abandoned by the family and was found in a very cold night, wrapped in a very thin piece of blanket or even whatever, because parents somehow didn't want this newborn infant. And then this newborn infant would survive a cold night. And you always wonder, right? And if you told this to my mom, of course, she will say that it's, God protects infants, right? So because they don't have nobody until they develop a relationship with the parents. And so, but I always, would try to tell her that there is more to it than just God protecting the infants. And so it turns out that at birth, human infants have this brown fat deposition, okay, that is distributed as shown here. If you see the infant here, you see the brown part. This brown part, both in front and back, you can see how nicely it is localized on this infant in a very, very important part of the body. This portion of the body of infant actually has the major blood vessels and internal organs. Very, very important. And it is there because turns out that this brown fat, as shown here, protects this infant. Okay, this is a mechanism, evolution, where an infant would be protected from the elements, especially cold weather. And if you want to know more about it, this brown fat that actually you are seeing here literally goes away, okay, once you are an adult. So there is no major reserve for brown fat. And I'm not sure, I will show you the structure of brown fat cells, right, in a minute, and you will see why this could be important. But it basically is a very, very specialized cells, these bad cells. And these bad cells, produces, let me go to the next slide. Maybe I can talk a little more about that. So yeah, so here you are seeing a white fat, which is the normal fat we have once we are an adult, white adipocyte, right? And if you look here in a typical, white adipocytes, right, you will see that white adipocyte cells are much larger than the brown adipocyte cells right here on the right. So bad cells are on the right and white cell on the left, white adipocytes and brown adipocytes. So white adipocytes are clearly larger, right? And it contains, if you see, yellow, big yellow portion. This is a huge lipid droplet, single huge lipid droplet that is almost squeezing the mitochondria and the nucleus near the plasma membrane. Okay, that's what white adipocyte looks like. This is what the white fat looks like in us. Okay. On the other hand, if you look at the brown adipocytes, these are really great cells. If we can make more of them, excuse me, I got too excited. My dog is excited outside. I apologize. When you look at these brown adipocyte cells, you can clearly see that it has many number of mitochondria, right? You can see, and the second thing you'll notice is, of course, it is smaller than the white adipocyte cells, but it has a uniformly distributed lipid particles in the entire cells. And nucleus is somewhat is in the center, centrally located, right? And so that's the difference between bat and wet, okay? And this brown adipose tissues, if we can somehow produce, genetically engineer, do some kind of gene therapy to produce more of brown adipose tissues in our bodies and cells, we might be less prone to obesity, okay? And the reason I'm not going to talk about a very detailed molecular basis of how these cells work, but one thing I want to mention is that these bat cells produce a group of proteins called thermogenins, okay? And this thermogenin is the protein that actually uncouples respiration to ATP production. Remember we talked about uncouplers? So this thermogenin also is an uncoupling protein, okay? And it's primarily found in the mitochondria of bat tissues, okay? And its main role is to generate heat by non-shivering mechanism, okay? Non-shivering thermogenesis, what we call. Now I want to just, I think a little bit running out of time here, but I just want to quickly mention that, our body runs at a fixed temperature of 37 degrees centigrade, right? And that 37 degrees centigrade is maintained by hypothalamus. Actually, hypothalamus is the one that sets the temperature for our body, if everything is well. And so when we get sick, right? Let's say when we get infected with a virus, right? It turns out that hypothalamus will detect, our immune response will be turned on, and hypothalamus will detect our immune response to this, invasion. And the way it actually tries to fight those invaders is that it raises the set temperature of your body, okay? And once it raises the set temperature of your body, let's say it will say now the set temperature is 50 degree. So your body has to, why does it raise the temperature? It turns out that for hypothalamus, raising the temperature means fighting those microbes. It turns out that those microbes cannot survive well at those higher temperatures. And there is also some evidence to suggest that at higher temperature, your immune response is better, okay? So this is the beauty. Think about evolution. So hypothalamus sets the body temperature to now new temperature, 50 degree, and that is to kill those microbes, invaders, and to make sure that the immune system works efficiently and clears the viruses or bacteria, whatever. And so that's why when you have your body's temperature is, hypothalamus sets the temperature to 50 degrees centigrade, let's say, then what happens is you feel cold and you shiver. The shivering is a mechanism to actually produce heat. So that's one way to produce heat. And because the reason you are feeling cold, although your body temperature is high, because your body temperature is set to a new temperature, which is much higher than your usual temperature. And so that's why you are feeling cold. That's the feeling of cold when you have fever. I hope I'm able to explain to you this in a way that is simple to understand, right? So you feel cold because technically you are colder than the body's new set point temperature, right? And it takes time to adjust. Anyway, so this brown adipose tissues, this thermogenin, is a protein that is called an uncoupling protein that will produce heat by non-shivering thermogenesis mechanism. Okay. And so what it does is it allows you to produce heat, but not produce ATP, right? That's what uncoupling means. Allows for the fast oxidation of the substrates with a very low rate of ATP production. And there is a very important, and cool signaling pathway that we are totally not able to discuss in this class, but just so you know. Anyway, that's cool, right? And so this is how God saves infants from, so those brown adipose tissues, they will produce heat actually and protect those important organs and blood vessels in the infant in the cold temperature. Anyway, so now let's go back. Let's talk about a new system, which is this the system of creatine kinase. So, when you are doing a strenuous exercise, right, your glycogen gets exhausted from your skeletal muscles because, your muscle cells are carrying out glycolysis, and you know that glycolysis is capable of explosive burst of ATP production that will be needed during the strenuous exercise, right? And so, yeah, look at this. Flux of glucose 6-phosphate through glycolysis can increase about 2,000-fold almost instantaneously. So that you can see, go-to for your muscle is glycolysis, right? If you remember the action of epinephrine hormone, right? How epinephrine actually stimulates glycolysis and glycogen breakdown. But if you do strenuous exercise, your glycogen levels are depleted. It turns out that our muscles are still ready, even though glycogen is completely depleted, because they have something different and unique. Okay. And so they have this molecule called phosphocreatine. Okay. This phosphocreatine molecule is the molecule that acts as a buffer system. And the buffer system is this enzyme called creatine kinase and phosphocreatine. This is a buffer system to maintain constant amount of ATP for the cells, for the muscle cells. And you know how much of phosphocreatine exists in your muscle cells? It's about 10 to 30 millimolar. Mark the word millimolar. That's how much phosphocreatine we have in our muscle cells, right? So this is a buffer system that muscles can use, because when muscles are doing active glycolysis, that you'll produce lactate also, right? And lactate will lower the pH of the blood, and the muscles will have muscle fatigue, etc. So this phosphocreatine and creatine kinase buffering system provides ATP when the glycogens are all depleted. How does that work? First of all, I want to show you the reaction, right? The phosphocreatine molecule is shown here on the left. You can see that it is a phosphorylated species. You can see phosphoryl group shaded in the blue here, right? And this phosphocreatine molecule is synthesized in the liver and usually transported to the muscle cells via the bloodstream for storage. That's where it is stored, 10 to 30 millimolar concentration. But the mechanism by which this phosphocreatine is utilized to rapidly generate ATP so that muscles can use that ATP is catalyzed by this enzyme creatine kinase. Creatine kinase will take phosphocreatine and ADP molecule and create ATP and creatine. Cool. So that's the reaction that actually is catalyzed by creatine kinase. So what happens during muscle contraction? Well, it turns out that when you are actually, your muscles are resting, are doing light activity, then you are able to use fatty acids, ketone bodies, or blood glucose for producing ATP, right? So you can see pink box through red arrow going to carbon dioxide. But you started doing burst of heavy activity, then your muscle glycogen, which is 1% of your muscle weight, will be depleted, right? And you'll produce lactate. But even that is gone. You need to do more, you need more energy, right? For your heavy activity that you are still doing. So in that sense, this phosphocreatine acts as a buffer. With the help of creatine kinase, phosphocreatine will react with ADP to generate ATP. And that ATP will be utilized for muscle contraction. So that's what is shown here. Different fuels are used for ATP synthesis during the bursts of heavy activity and during light activity or rest, right? And during the burst of heavy activities, phosphocreatine can rapidly provide ATP, because it will transfer its phosphoryl group to ADP to generate ATP and creatine. So that's something that comes very handy. And in fact, people have done this very interesting experiment to demonstrate that even during rigorous exercise that you are doing, okay, your ATP levels in the cells remain almost constant. They buffer, okay. How do they do? What experiments they do? They basically have done a very simple NMR experiment where they have taken NMR of this, they have taken the ATP level, right? They have labeled the ATP phosphoryl group with a phosphorus 31 and phosphocreatine with a phosphorus 31. And they basically are able to take NMR spectra. What you are seeing here is that NMR signal is shown on the y-axis and the chemical shift is on the x-axis, right? This is a stack plot, basically, where your levels are, you are monitoring the levels of inorganic phosphate, PI, phosphocreatine, and ATP using the labeled phosphorus 31. So you are able to monitor all these three species using simple NMR experiment. And you will see what they have done on this stack plot. On the right-hand side, if you see rest, in red, they are showing the exercise time, the time when the person was doing exercise, and then during the recovery phase. They are just drawing the samples and actually measuring the concentration of these three species. And you'll see that during rest, of course, you have ATP concentration. You can see all these peaks here, right? 3 phosphoryl peaks, clearly you can see. And you also see a nice, good amount of phosphocreatine during the rest. And almost none inorganic phosphate. No, very little concentration of inorganic phosphate. PI is very little. When you are doing exercise, as shown here in the red, the time zone, you are still seeing that ATP concentration is maintained to the same amount as the rest. But what you will notice is that once you measure the phosphocreatine levels, that phosphocreatine levels has dramatically gone down. Where has it gone? Well, it has gone down to make more an ATP so that ATP levels remain normal in the cells. That's where it disappeared. That's why there is a dip in the phosphocreatine level. And you see that because during exercise, you'll be hydrolyzing ATP, you are seeing during exercise that increased in inorganic phosphate concentration, PI concentration, right? So that all makes sense. And then once you are recovering, liver will synthesize more of phosphocreatine and send it to muscle cells and try to replenish the phosphocreatine levels. And that's what you are seeing during the recovery phase. Pretty cool, right? Very simple to know. But you think about it, what is happening even when you are doing very rigorous exercise, your muscle cells can still produce ATP from phosphocreatine and maintain that constant level of ATP that your cells need. Cool. So your muscle cells, it turns out, and this already, we have discussed this briefly, there is a metabolic cooperation between the skeletal muscles and the liver. And that's in the form of lactate that are being produced in the muscle cells, goes to the liver where it is converted back to glucose, and glucose is supplied into the blood and goes back to the muscle cells. Okay, so this is the Cori cycle, right? Your muscles are utilizing the glycogen, for example, right? They will produce ATP by rapid glycolysis, but then in the process, they will produce lactate because it's an anaerobic condition. That lactate will go through the blood to the liver. In the liver, lactate will be converted to pyruvate, lactate dehydrogenase enzyme, remember? And that pyruvate can then become a substrate for gluconeogenesis. And therefore, you can actually utilize ATP in the liver. And if you recall, we utilize 4 ATP molecule, right? 2 GTP molecule and 2 NADH molecule. Remember, gluconeogenesis is an expensive process, right? Production of pyruvate to glucose 6-phosphate, needs 4 ATP, 2 GTP and 2 NADH. But liver will do that. Liver will do gluconeogenesis, make new glucose molecules and release it into the blood so it can be taken up by the muscle cells again. And so that's what we call it Cori cycle. Okay, glucose to lactate to glucose constitutes the Cori cycle, right? In one process, ATP is produced in the muscles, in the liver it is utilized, and there is a play between interplay of glucose and lactate. All right. Okay, so that brings me to talking a little bit about brain. And so brain has a very high metabolism, okay, and normally uses only glucose as a primary fuel. It can use ketone bodies such as beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate that could be produced in the liver from fatty acid in fasting conditions or in conditions where there is a metabolic disorder where we cannot utilize glucose as fuel. So once these ketone bodies are synthesized by the liver, they actually go to the brain where they are converted back to the acetyl coenzyme A, and acetyl coenzyme A can be utilized by the brain in citric acid cycle, right? And the reaction I showed you before already is this right here. I just want to remind you that yes, indeed, you can take beta hydroxybutyrate, right, and convert that to acetoacetate by beta hydroxybutyrate dehydrogenase in an NAD plus dependent reaction. And once you have acetoacetate, then you can convert that to acetoacetyl coenzyme A, and then acetoacetyl coenzyme A can be converted to 2 molecules of acetyl coenzyme A by the help of enzyme thiolase. And that acetyl coenzyme A can then enter the citric acid cycle in the brain cells when the glucose is not available, right? You know that already we have seen. And so the fuel that supplies ATP in the brain does depend on the nutritional state, right? Normal diet, if you have glucose, you will actually utilize glucose to make ATP. But if you are starving and if you have type 2 diabetes, then ketone bodies become the primary fuel and they will metabolize to give you ATP, right? To give you means to give your brain ATP. And so one thing I want to mention, and we talked about that, if you remember, right? For normal cells, right? In normal cells, you have sodium potassium ATPase as well. Okay. And in normal cells, sodium potassium ATPase uses 20% of the total energy of the cell, so that sodium potassium ATPase can function. Remember, sodium potassium ATPase is very, very important transporter we talked about at length, which basically expels sodium ion from inside the cell and brings in potassium ion. And it's an ATP dependent, it's an active transporter, if you recall. In neuronal cells, sodium potassium ATPase eats away 2/3 of the cell's energy. Like literally 67% of the ATP is eaten up by the neurons, in the neurons by the sodium potassium ATPase. And this is a very, very important transporter system for neuronal cells. You know, it helps maintain transmembrane potential that is very, very important for information transfer among neurons, right? It also helps regulate cell volume. It helps regulate transport of certain metabolites, different among different organs, etc. So yeah, that's something that electrogenic transport by sodium potassium ATPase in the neurons takes up 2/3 of the ATP that is being produced. Just so you know. And so can I demonstrate that? Yeah, you can actually say, this is one reason why I tell my students to always have some sugars or candies when they're taking exams and keep their brain stimulated during the exam, not overstimulated. That's not. So it turns out that we can actually ingest fluorine 18 labeled glucose. Remember, we talked about that positron emitter. So this technique of PET, positron emission tomography, a scan is typically done when a person is actually given this molecule, shown written here at the bottom, fluorine 18 derivative of the glucose. And glucose goes to the brain and everywhere else. And you can detect this glucose molecule because it emits 2 gamma photons once that positron annihilates with surrounding electrons. Anyway, so that has a deep penetration. Gamma rays have deep penetration, so you can actually scan the brain going from front to back. And that's what is shown here. From front to back in the horizontal directions, they are showing you a PET scan. Okay. If you have a well-rested brain, you can see that well-rested brain has uniform density and more of red colors you are seeing, and green here, and black, uniformly distributed. This is a well-rested brain. That's what it looks like if you do the PET scan. But if you stayed up all night and studied for the exam, and you are stressed on top of that, your brain is overactive, overstimulated. And so that's what this sleep deprived brain looks like at the bottom. And you will see that as in sleep deprived brain, you have a lot more of green colors than red colors. And if you look here at the bottom, that's what they show you the color coding here. A nice color coding will be somewhere in the black region and the red region, right? They're showing you the amount of glucose metabolism that actually is going on by those cells, milligram per 100 gram per minute. So a well-rested brain has a nice active metabolism. It's able to function properly. But if you are sleep deprived, you can see that it is actually quite, quite tired brain, it looks like, right? So yeah. To take home lesson is that be well rested and be a little bit loaded on the sugar when you are taking exam. Okay, so a little bit about the blood itself, composition of blood. If you take whole blood, you can actually centrifuge the whole blood and separate the blood plasma from the cells. So cells are shown here on the left-hand side. They are showing you red blood cells, erythrocytes, white blood cells, leukocytes, and platelets, etc. Almost 50% of the blood volume is that. And then 50% is blood plasma, out of which almost 90% is water. Okay. And then 10% is this plasma solutes. Okay. And I don't have to memorize this. This is just for you to know. And in that 10% of the plasma solutes, out of that 10%, you have 10% as inorganic ions like sodium chloride, bicarbonate, etc. Then you have about 20% of organic metabolites and waste products. That would be glucose, amino acids, urea, etc., ketone bodies. And then 70% of the 10% would be these plasma proteins, right? Plasma proteins such as serum albumin, very low density lipoproteins, etc. And certain specialized transport proteins like transferrins. Transferrin is a protein that transfers iron from one place to the other in your blood. Okay, so that's how blood composition is. And I always tell my students, sometimes, when we have a family member who is diabetic and he or she is on a medication, we have to very, very closely monitor that person all the time. And we have to monitor that person all the time very carefully for why? Not for high glucose levels so much, but for low glucose levels. We have to make sure that that patient is keenly observed for hypoglycemia, hypo, lower level of sugar level. Okay. And why is that? And this is a very important lesson for you and everyone, is that here is the blood glucose level they're showing you. How many milligrams per 100 milliliter, right? And normal range is anywhere between 70 to 100 milligram per 100 milliliter. Okay, so that's what they're showing you, normal range here. And if you calculate that into the concentration, it will come out somewhere to be about 4.5 millimolar to 5 millimolar. Okay. So that's what you want to maintain, whether we have diabetes or we don't have diabetes. The sugar levels are constantly maintained in our blood, right? By various mechanisms. You know that. But we have to be very, very careful about the low sugar levels in the blood, hypoglycemia. Because if the sugar level drops to around, let's say 50 to 60 milligram per 100 mil, then that person would actually feel some kind of uneasiness, neurological signs you will start to see, trembling, sweating, etc. And if you don't observe that signal, blood level can further drop to the levels, let's say 30 to 40. You see, at 40, they have a red line. That's really a bad scene. So if your blood level falls below 40 milligram per 100 mil, then that thing can actually lead to convulsions, coma, permanent brain damage if it was not right away taken care, and even death. So I always tell my students to always observe their loved ones for hypoglycemia. And sometimes it can happen when the medication was changed, right? From one medication to other medication, and there was an extra dose that nobody expected that would lower the blood glucose level so much. So that's why you want to always observe these people whenever there is a change in medication. And I always say that you should always have a candy around. If any of these symptoms happens, you first throw a spoonful of sugar in person's mouth and then think about anything else. Okay, this is not a medical advice, so please don't come back and sue me for that, but just be observant about that. Okay, so now I want to spend last 10 slides, I think, in talking about the roles of these three hormones on our metabolism. And this is all you know again, but I'm just going to put that in the big picture, okay? So when we talk about hormonal regulations, we will talk first about, when you had a nice rich meal, well-fed state, what we call. In well-fed state, your liver is lipogenic. What does that mean? In well-fed state, your liver will actually synthesize triacylglycerols and try to store them in itself and transport them into adipocytes for storage if needed. And it will also try to synthesize glycogen. That will happen in the liver. Okay, so that's what lipogenic liver means. How? What happens in well-fed state? Let's say you had a nice rich meal, calorie-rich meal that contains glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids, right? It's shown here in intestine. They're showing you on the left, right? Glucose will enter the liver, right, through blood vessels. It is brought in. Liver will try to export some of the glucose if needed so that it can go to the glucose, to the brain for metabolism. Some of those glucose will be also channeled to adipose tissues for glycolysis, and some of it will also go to muscle cells, right? Where muscle cells will metabolize glucose. How that process happens? Well, whenever glucose levels are high in the blood, pancreas will release insulin, right, from the beta cells. And insulin will go to brain, adipose tissues, and muscles. And it will go and bind to the insulin receptors and try to bring glucose molecule in. And that's what is shown here. So glucose, because it's a well-fed state, glucose will also try to, liver will also try to utilize glucose to synthesize glycogen, right? So that glycogen levels are, depleted glycogen levels are now replenished. Some of the glucose will get converted to acetyl coenzyme A, right, and will produce ATP, etc. But acetyl coenzyme A will get converted to triacylglycerol, right? It will promote fatty acid synthesis. Fatty acid synthesis happens in the cytosol of the liver. Okay, so that will happen. And so TAG is triacylglycerol. Triacylglycerol will be converted to VLDL, which is called very low density lipoproteins, right? VLDL is one of the 5 major groups of lipoproteins. What are those 5 major groups of lipoproteins? Well, one, chylomicron. Then this one is VLDL, right? Then you have LDL, low density lipoproteins. Then you have IDL, intermediate density lipoprotein. And then you have HDL, high density lipoproteins. Those are the 5 groups. So VLDL is one of the 5. And VLDL is very, very important. It allows the fats and cholesterol to move within the water-based solution of the bloodstream. Okay, very, very important. So that VLDLs will be synthesized and exported to other tissues, and that will go into the adipose tissues, and it will go to the muscle tissues. So that's what happens when your liver is feeling well fed, lipogenic liver. Why is it lipogenic? Because you are synthesizing fatty acids. What happens to the amino acids? Amino acids will also travel to the blood vessels, right? And they will be brought into the liver where they will be metabolized. They will generate alpha keto acids, right? Yes. And they may be utilized to make new proteins for the liver. Remember, liver proteins are turned over at a much faster rate. And so that's what happens with the amino acids. Fat will move through the lymphatic system in the form of chylomicron and will be brought into the liver. And that's what you are seeing, TAG here. Fat will also go to the muscle cells where fatty acids will undergo beta oxidation to produce ATP and carbon dioxide. Right? So what happens? It turns out that insulin, when it is released by the pancreas in a well-fed state, will promote conversion of excess glucose to glycogen, right? And triacylglycerols, and export them into synthesis of triacylglycerols that will happen in the liver and in adipocytes. So this is something that you should know, right? You already know this. Remember what can happen to the amino acids. If you have excess amino acids in the liver, it can be converted to, for example, alpha keto acid like pyruvate, right? And pyruvate can be utilized to make glucose if needed. And that glucose can be stored as glycogen, right? So excess amino acids can be converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate and acetyl coenzyme A, what will happen to coenzyme A? Coenzymes are used to make fatty acids, new types of fatty acids that can be stored in the liver as well. Right? So I know we are trying to repeat ourselves here, but I just want you to, be aware of what could be happening during well-fed state in the lipogenic liver. Now you may ask, okay, conversion of taking acetyl coenzyme A and synthesizing fatty acids, won't they require NADPH, right? It's the fatty acid synthesis. Yeah, if NADPH is needed, you know that you can actually obtain NADPH from the oxidation of glucose molecule via pentose phosphate pathway, right? So indeed, you can actually, you will do that if needed to synthesize triacylglycerols. All right, so net effect of insulin on blood glucose is to upregulate glucose uptake in the muscle and adipose tissues. And the target enzyme that does this is glucose transporter, GLUT4, insulin-dependent glucose transporter. Insulin will also upregulate glucose uptake in the liver, right? And that enzyme is glucokinase, the one that with a higher Km. Insulin will upregulate glycogen synthesis in the liver and muscle cells. Why? Because it will upregulate glycogen synthase activity. When glycogen synthesis is upregulated, glycogen breakdown is downregulated. You see downward arrow here in the liver and muscle cells. How will that happen? Glycogen phosphorylase will be downregulated and so on. Glycolysis will be upregulated. Acetyl coenzyme A production will be upregulated in liver and muscle cells. What enzymes would be involved there? PFK1 activity will be upregulated. How does that PFK1 activity upregulated? By PFK2 enzyme. PFK2 enzyme is the one that makes fructose 2,6-bisphosphate from fructose 6-phosphate. Remember, fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, this is a low energy indicator, very, very important allosteric regulator. Yeah, that's what PFK2 will do. So PFK2 activity will be upregulated, which will then upregulate the activity of PFK1. Right? Because you will have fructose 2,6-bisphosphate concentration going up. Fatty acid synthesis will be upregulated in the liver. And the enzyme that is upregulated will be acetyl coenzyme-CoA carboxylase. Remember acetyl CoA carboxylase, that's a biotin dependent enzyme that catalyzes the irreversible step in the fatty acid synthesis pathway. Carboxylation of that reaction is carboxylation of acetyl coenzyme A to produce malonyl coenzyme A. Yep. And you'll upregulate triacylglycerol synthesis in the adipose tissues. And the enzyme that we didn't talk about is lipoprotein lipases will be affected, upregulated. Okay, so pancreas again is a wonderful organ. It contains both exocrine cells that secrete many of the digestive enzymes that are stored in the form of zymogens, right? And it also contains these endocrine cells, shown here: alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells, right? Endocrine cells are the cells that secrete hormones, right? And so the beta cells will secrete insulin, and alpha cells will secrete glucagon, right? They will secrete into the blood vessels, and then they will go to their respective receptors. Could it be fat cells or muscle cells, and start the process downstream. Now, a question students often ask is, is there a correlation between how much of insulin is needed in the blood versus how much of sugar we ingested, right? Let's say you eat very little sugar, very little amount. It doesn't make a sense for your pancreas to release tons of insulin or same amount of insulin, whatever it is, right? Versus when you eat a lot more sugar, a lot more carb-rich meal. So indeed, the amount of blood glucose determines how much of insulin is released from the pancreatic beta cells. Oh, that makes sense. Because remember, you want to normalize the glucose level in the blood to be about 4.5, 5 millimolar. You don't want it to go too low or too high. You want to maintain homeostasis, right? And so, indeed, there is a regulatory mechanism to regulate how much of insulin is secreted by the pancreatic beta cells. And to give you a little appreciation of that, I'm showing you this slide. This cell here is a pancreatic beta cell, okay? And in this, you can see that they are showing you nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, and Golgi here, right? And so what determines how much insulin is released is regulated by the amount of glucose. What kind of signaling goes on in this? Remember, when glucose levels go high, pancreatic beta cells will sense glucose levels, right? And so glucose will be brought into the pancreatic beta cells. This turns out that the pancreatic beta cells have also this enzyme glucokinase or hexokinase 4 that will actually bring glucose in and convert glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Remember, glucose sensing mechanism will be on in these pancreatic beta cells as well because of the Km for glucose for hexokinase 4 is 10 millimolar, okay? So it will be operating under kcat by Km conditions, right? Rate will be dependent on the substrate concentration. So the more glucose molecules comes in, the more glucose 6-phosphate will be produced. That glucose phosphate will undergo glycolysis, citric acid cycle, oxphos, etc., and produce ATP. So ATP concentration will start to rise. You see arrows going up. When ATP concentration rises above certain levels, what will happen is that there is an ATP gated potassium channel in these pancreatic beta cells. Gated means it will allow the movement of this ion, in this case potassium ion, only when the gate is open. Otherwise, it will be closed. And so it is ATP gated, which means the concentration of ATP will determine whether potassium can move in and out or not, can move to out in the extracellular space from inside the cell. So when ATP concentration rises, this ATP gated potassium channel will close. That's why this red X circle. And so when the potassium ion can no longer go out, it will lead to the depolarization of the plasma membrane. Okay, these plasma membranes try to maintain a resting potential. That mechanism will be messed up because potassium ion cannot go out. Okay, so it will lead to the depolarization of the plasma membrane. In the same plasma membrane, there is another channel which is now voltage gated. That channel responds to the change in membrane potential. Okay, so this is a voltage gated calcium channel shown here in the green. So when the membrane depolarizes, the voltage gated calcium channel will open up, and then it will start to bring calcium ion from the extracellular space to inside. So calcium will start to flow into the cell. Once calcium ion concentration rises, there is a synergy. Okay, the endoplasmic reticulum will also release calcium ion, more calcium ion, and therefore by leading to higher amount of calcium ion, much higher amount of calcium ion in the cell. Okay, so it turns out that what happens then, that increased amount of calcium ion will trigger the release of insulin granules by exocytosis into the extracellular space. There is a correlation. The amount of glucose comes in will dictate how much of insulin is secreted by exocytosis. Okay, so higher the amount, the more insulin secretion. Now, insulin synthesis, I just want to briefly mention, I already told you this, but you know that insulin is synthesized, right, by the significant amount only in the beta cells of the pancreas, right? And the synthesis of insulin happens, insulin is, if you recall, is synthesized as a single polypeptide, right? There is a single messenger RNA that will translate as a single chain. And that chain is called pre-proinsulin, if you remember from the last class, right? Where a signal peptide is removed during the insertion of this proinsulin, what we call, into the endoplasmic reticulum, right? And so when the signal is on, when insulin needs to be activated, right? That proinsulin, if you remember, has 3 domains. It has both A, B, and C chains, remember? And so proinsulin, goes and actually gets activated in the Golgi, where there are several endopeptidases, proteases that will actually remove the C peptide, and thereby generating a mature insulin, which will now comprise of only A chain and B chain, right? Insulin and free C peptides are packaged together in the Golgi into what we are seeing here as insulin granules. And so those insulin granules actually secrete active insulin. Cool, right? So this is how it happens. Yeah. Oh, then that's in the fed state. What happens in the fasting state? In fasting state, you have the glucogenic liver. Okay, so if you didn't have the meal, right, liver becomes the primary source of glucose for the brain. So how that happens? So you are seeing here, when the sugar levels are low, pancreas will release glucagon, right, from the alpha cells. And that will promote glycogen breakdown, right? glycogen breakdown will produce glucose 1-phosphate that will then be converted by glucose 6-phosphate. That's what they are showing you here by phosphoglucomutase, if you remember. And phosphoglucose 6-phosphate can be converted to glucose by glucose 6-phosphatase system. And then glucose is released for the brain, right? Cool. Amino acids that can come from the breakdown of muscle proteins in some cases, or from the proteins of the liver itself. Those amino acids can be metabolized to generate pyruvate, and then pyruvate can go on through gluconeogenesis to produce glucose, right? So that's how the liver is becoming glucogenic. It's producing new glucose molecule in the fasting state. Cool. In fasting state, if you remember, liver will also make break down fatty acids, right, to make ketone bodies. So it can export ketone bodies to the brain for metabolism, because brain likes either glucose or ketone bodies. So that's what will happen, right? And fatty acids will, of course, they're showing will also get degraded into ATP. Adipose tissues will transfer triacylglycerols, neutral fat. Fatty acids will go to the liver, some of it, and then make ketone bodies for the brain, right? Glycerol is not wasted. If you remember, we talked about this. Glycerol can be converted to dihydroxyacetone phosphate. And dihydroxyacetone phosphate can be converted to one of the glycolysis intermediate that can be utilized to make new glucose molecule, right? So glycerol becomes a source as well, right? So, so if you look here, you are able to make new glucose from glycerol molecules that can come from adipose tissues, or from the breakdown of amino acids that can come from either muscles or from the liver protein itself to make new glucose molecules, right? So yeah, that's something that you already know again. And so effect of glucagon on blood glucose similarly is shown here in this table, right? When glucagon is released, it will actually promote the breakdown of glycogen in the liver, right? And so net effect is that you'll have more glucose. The enzyme that is directly affected is glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase activity will be upregulated, right? And so I will let you compare this table to the other table. All of these enzymes, all these pathways, in fact, we have talked about this in the class. So it is just a summary for you, so you can actually, spend a lot of time thinking, that makes sense. Yeah, this makes sense too. This makes sense, right? We have discussed every one of these pathways. Glucagon will promote gluconeogenesis in the liver, right? Amino acids, glycerol, etc., will be converted to glucose. The enzymes that are affected is fructose bisphosphatase 2, pyruvate kinase, pep carboxykinase. Fatty acid metabolism is upregulated. When that happens, less glucose will be used by the liver and muscle cells, right? Because it's trying to mobilize the fatty acids. How will that happen? What enzymes are affected? Remember hormone sensitive lipases that will go, and once it is activated by pKa, will go and phosphorylate perilipin and try to mobilize fat droplets from adipocytes. Yeah, we talked about that. So this is just a summary of what you already know. So I'm not going to spend any more time on those tables. Again, I have shown you this table and I've talked about this. Sometimes it's good to be having little extra weight, especially if we are going to an island where there is going to be food scarcity. You can see here normal weight of person has 141 or if you want to go in kilojoule, which is what we are used to, about 589,000 kilojoule of energy stored as in the form of triacylglycerols, right, in adipose tissues. But if the person is double the weight, then you can see that now the same person has 3,140 kilojoule, 1,000 kilojoule of energy, right? So almost, 5-6 times more. And so that is helpful when there is a food scarcity, because you can see that an average person would survive only for 3 months when there is no food. But this person with a weight of 140 kilogram will survive for almost 14 months. Again, if you look carefully in this table, you will see that the amount of proteins, glycogen, and other fuels are almost about the same. It's the obesity that's why it creates a lot more adipocytes in our body, and that's what stores most of the fat. And that fat can be utilized. We talked about in the context of seals, right? Polar bear eating lots of seals before they undergo hibernation. Okay, so I think let's a little bit talk about what happens to the metabolism in the liver when you have prolonged fasting, such as some of you are doing during Eid, or in uncontrolled diabetes. Okay, so again, you're seeing the liver, right, and you are seeing some of these pathways, and the effect in these yellow rectangular boxes. You're seeing arrows, blue arrows going upward and downward. They have the same meaning, right? As I told you before, when you see these dashed arrows, that means that pathway is not happening efficiently. That's what it means here. Okay, so let's look what happens in the liver when you are fasting. When you're fasting, obviously you will break down your proteins, liver proteins, right? Protein degradation will happen. And if you have glucogenic amino acids in those proteins, they will be utilized to make some intermediates for the citric acid cycle here. So one, and then when amino acids are metabolized, you'll know that you'll produce urea. So number 2 is urea is exported to the kidneys and excreted in urine, right? Carbon portion of the amino acid will be taken up. They will serve as an intermediate of citric acid cycle, right? But remember, if you're fasting, your liver will try to actually make new glucose molecule for the brain, right? So it will try to promote gluconeogenesis. So you can see that they are taking the oxaloacetate from here, and then there is an arrow going upward, blue arrow, to generate PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate, that will ultimately lead to the generation of glucose through gluconeogenesis, and the glucose is exported to the brain via the bloodstream, right? Because you are not able to do glucose metabolism, you're fasting, of course you are degrading protein, but your fatty acids also will start to arrive in the liver, right? It will come from the adipose tissues and whatever is stored in the liver itself. So they will start to arrive in the liver, and they will start to get metabolized into acetyl coenzyme A, beta oxidation. Okay, unfortunately, what will happen? Acetyl coenzyme A, to go through citric acid cycle, it will need oxaloacetate to produce citrate. But there is not enough oxaloacetate present. Why? Because oxaloacetate is now being diverted away to make new glucose molecule in this pathway number 4. So therefore, acetyl coenzyme A will accumulate, right? Lack of oxaloacetate prevents acetyl-CoA entry into the citric acid cycle. Therefore, acetyl-CoA will accumulate. That's why these dashed arrows, it is not moving very effectively, the citric acid cycle. So when acetyl coenzyme accumulates, it will favor ketone biosynthesis, right? Ketone bodies, beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate. So you make ketone bodies and then you will export those ketone bodies via bloodstream to the brain, which can use them as fuel, right? So after depletion of carbohydrates, proteins and fatty acids become the important, protein becomes the important source of glucose, and fatty acid becomes important source for producing ketone bodies, right? You know that already. So indeed, if you actually look in a normal human, if you're starting to starve, you will almost have very little ketone bodies. Healthy individuals don't produce ketone bodies. But you will also notice in the red here that after even 2 days of starvation, right, we have this mechanism to control the levels of glucose in the blood to normal. Despite that, glucose levels starts to come down after 2 days of starvation, right? So there are hormonal mechanisms for maintaining the level of glucose, but it's not perfect. Glucose will begin to diminish after 2 days of fasting, as you see here. And ketone bodies will start to appear more and more and will stabilize as you starve more and more. Okay, so that's something that you should know. The physiological and metabolic effects of epinephrine, the third hormone, you know, is that epinephrine, when it's released, remember it's a fight or flight hormone. So it will increase the heart rate, it will increase the blood pressure, and it will actually dilate your respiratory passages. So you can have increased delivery of oxygen to the tissues. But it also has other metabolic effect, right? It will promote glycogen breakdowns in muscles and livers that will lead to the increased production of glucose for fuel. It will downregulate glycogen synthesis in the muscles and liver and promote gluconeogenesis in the liver. So all these pathways, you know, we have talked about that at length. So make sure that they all come to you. I'm not going to talk about that very much. Now, one question we ask is that we eat lunch and dinner. Sometimes we eat less, sometimes we eat more, right? Some meals. And we still maintain almost a constant mass. And how does that happen, right? It's a curious question. And I wanted to talk about that a very little bit, okay? And it turns out that there is a set point model that actually explains how we maintain a constant mass during normal course of metabolism. When you ingest food, right, what happens is that your adipose tissues will expand, okay? So mass of adipose tissues will increase. Why? Because food, it will try to bring, for example, fatty acids into and store it in the adipose tissues. And so you can see the dashed boundaries are now the new boundaries of adipose tissues. When that happens, when that volume of the adipose tissues increases, right, it will actually release this hormone called leptin. Leptin is a 16 kilodalton peptide hormone. Leptin is the hormone that will go and bind to your receptors in the hypothalamus and will tell you to stop eating. That's why it says X mark, right? And it will promote, you see the down arrows, it will promote the oxidation of fatty acids, beta oxidation. So you can actually generate energy as well as heat if needed. So leptin actually is this way that controls the amount of food intake, fatty acid synthesis, and energy yielding beta oxidation pathway, etc. Right? So when the mass of adipose tissues increases, right, released in leptin will inhibit feeding and fatty acid synthesis. That's why X, and will stimulate oxidation of fatty acids as shown here in the green arrow. So that's what the set point model is. Now, I wanted to, talk to you about this leptin receptor itself. Okay. And few more slides. So I hope I don't go over the time. I still have 5 minutes, but I wanted to show you a little bit, something cool. You see these two mice here? They're of the same age, okay? And they both have defects in their obesity gene, okay? That receptor is missing, obesity receptor, leptin receptor. The obesity gene that actually contains the enzyme needed for the synthesis of leptin, okay? So both of them cannot synthesize leptin, or cannot respond to, cannot synthesize leptin. It turns out that, they are of the same age, etc. Mouse on the right you see here was injected daily with purified leptin hormone. So every morning, when he got up, somebody injected leptin hormone in this mice. And this one weighs about 35 grams, you can see. And this one weighs about 70 grams, double the weight. The mouse on the left did not get any leptin injection, okay? And mouse on the left, because it didn't get leptin injection, it ate voraciously all day long. And therefore, it actually became obese. It was less active as well. It won't move around. Just go eat food and then go back and sleep. Just think about the beauty of science. This is real data. Just the leptin synthesis gene, one of the gene was knocked out. So this, both of these mouse could not produce leptin hormone. But on the right-hand side, mouse was given leptin injection, but the left one side was not given. Cool? So what could be happening? It turns out that the leptin signal transduction goes through hypothalamus, and it follows a new mechanism called JAK-STAT, new to you. It's an old pathway, but new to you. It's a JAK-STAT mechanism of signal transduction. Okay, so leptin receptor here exists as a monomer when leptin is not there. But when leptin is released by the adipocytes, it will go and bind to the receptor, which is sitting in the plasma membrane. And once it binds, the leptin receptor will undergo dimerization. It will exist as a dimer. Once it exists as a dimer, it's not like it will autophosphorylate like insulin receptor. There is a kinase called Janus kinase, JAK. JAK will actually go and phosphorylate leptin receptor on two tyrosine residues. Okay. And so you can see that leptin receptor now has phosphate group on two tyrosine residues. Once that happens, there is another protein called STAT. Okay. STAT will go and bind to this phosphorylated leptin receptor via SH2 domain. SH2 domains are these domains that will go and bind to phosphorylated tyrosine residue. So that's why STAT will go and bind to the leptin receptor. Once it binds, another activity of Janus kinase will go and phosphorylate STAT also. Once STAT gets phosphorylated, it basically will form a dimer that looks like this. Only the dimeric form of STAT will be able to enter the nucleus, will be able to cross the nuclear membrane and enter the nucleus, where it will go and bind specific regulatory region of the DNA and will expression of certain genes that are responsible for organisms' feeding behavior and energy expenditure. It's a lot more complicated pathway. They're showing you neuropeptides and POMC, etc. That's a downstream messenger that will be produced that will regulate this organism's feeding behavior and energy expenditure, right? So that's how signal transduction happens in hypothalamus. from leptin hormone. Now, I always talk about this, right? And I never showed you this, I think, technically speaking. But this is a slide where I wanted to show you that indeed different types of signals can be integrated downstream, and they could lead to, similar outcome. Okay. And that is, as an example, I want to show you this crosstalk between the receptors. Remember, when we talked about signals transduction, I said two different receptors can bind two different ligands, and then they can produce the similar types of second messengers, right? Are different types of output, but the net output is the algebraic sum of those outputs, right? So here I am trying to show you how two different hormones like leptin and insulin, when they bind to their receptors, right, they can actually integrate that signal to a common substrate, in this case IRS2. Okay. So when insulin binds to insulin receptor, remember, insulin receptor itself has an intrinsic kinase activity that will go and phosphorylate insulin receptor substrates. Yeah, in this case, insulin receptor substrate is insulin receptor substrate 2, which is also a substrate of JAK-STAT signaling, leptin receptor signaling. Okay. So when leptin goes and binds to the leptin receptor, it will activate Janus activity kinase, JAK, right? Right? And JAK will go and phosphorylate also insulin receptor substrate 2. So you can see the integration of the signal through the same substrate. The net effect is the activation of PI3 kinase pathway. That's why the green arrow up. And when PI3 kinase pathway is upregulated, it will inhibit the food intake. And if you remember, not shown here is it will actually start to bring glucose into the cells for metabolism. So you can see that signals are integrated and they're working in sync. PI3 kinase, once it is activated, will inhibit the amount of food intake and will try to also at the same time bring glucose molecule, so glucose molecules can be metabolized for energy production of energy and inhibition of food intake. That's the ultimate output of leptin binding to leptin receptor, insulin binding to insulin receptor, and phosphorylating a common downstream substrate, IRS2, right? So IRS2 here is serving as an integrator of the two inputs from two different receptors. That's what I wanted to show. Okay, so that brings me to the end here. Last slide. I just hope that you enjoyed this class and you learned a lot. That was my intention, and I hope I was able to teach you something new, and I hope you learned something new. You may go on to do big things, maybe someday become a scientist, discover a new pathway, get a Nobel Prize, or become a top-notch neurosurgeon, or the best nurse, or a physician's assistant, whatever your dreams are. I hope whatever you learned will be useful to you. Let me stop the recording. But I just want to say that you have to believe in yourself and you have to keep working hard. At the same time, enjoying yourself whenever you get little time, hanging out with friends, And I always wish you good luck. Not sure what happened here. Let me stop the